Welcome to the Transatlantic, a podcast produced by the U.S. Helsinki Commission. Each episode, we will talk to people behind the debates and developments shaping the struggle for freedom and security here in the United States, Europe, Central Asia, and around the world. These conversations will cross oceans, intellectual divides, and political affiliations. We'll look forward to having you along for the ride. My name is Bakhti, and I'm a senior policy advisor at the Commission, and I will be your host.
Do you think people are more bogged down in their sort of partisan ways and they want free speech for themselves, but they don't want free speech for their enemies, foes, people they disagree with?
I do think we unfortunately have a prevalent free speech ideology, but that's a global issue where people say, of course I support free speech.
Yeah.
But, and then there's a few examples of who doesn't deserve speech rights.
Today, we are joined by Sarah McLaughlin. Sarah is a senior scholar working on global expression at the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression, and author of Authoritarians in the Academy: How the Internationalization of Higher Education and Borderless Censorship Threaten Free Speech. She writes regularly about the state of free speech around the world, and her work has been featured in outlets including Foreign Policy, The Guardian, and the Los Angeles Times.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Sarah, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a Friday afternoon. Obviously, when people are listening to this, it's not going to be a Friday afternoon, but we are here to talk about something incredible, something very important for this country and the global community, and that's freedom of speech and how things might be different here than in other places, and how that could be both an opportunity but also a threat. Before we kind of dive into the nitty-gritty of everything, let me ask you this. It's a broader, more conceptual question, but how do you think about freedom of speech? What's your conception of freedom of speech? Are there any limits? Should there be any limits to it? Should we just allow anything and everything goes and allow society to sort of figure it out? Or I would really appreciate that, because I think that is going to help us frame the conversation we're going to be having today.
Absolutely. So, first off, I'll start with the limits question. A lot of people look at people like myself, my colleagues at the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. They say, you're free speech absolutists. You think there are no limits. And we're close to free speech absolutists, I suppose, but we do think there are limits. And those are actually very well laid out under the law right now. Things like incitement to imminent lawless action, true threats. These things are rightfully exceptions under the First Amendment. You can't make a person believe that you're going to commit violent harm upon them in the near future and have that be construed as protected free speech. But more broadly, I see free speech as something that's absolutely vital to the human spirit, and also more broadly vital to human societies. I don't think that we can get very far either individually or as collective people in a collective society, if we can't express ourselves, if we can't ask difficult questions, if we can't have difficult conversations. And I think that's what's so beautiful about how we conceive of free speech here in the U.S. A lot of people actually have it backwards. They think that the First Amendment gives us rights and that the government gives us free speech. Actually, it's the other way around. Under First Amendment law and under the philosophy of this country, we believe that because we're human beings, that we are born with this innate right to speak, to express ourselves, to have our own thoughts, our own beliefs. And it's actually the government saying we're limited from stopping those rights. So the government doesn't give us our rights to free speech. The government's actually, not able to take those rights away. And that's really important to understand how these rights work and where they come from. They don't come from government.
Sarah, I think you should definitely call yourself a poet of free speech, because that was truly beautiful. I mean, I think if anyone was on the fence about how they feel about free speech, I think your conviction is shining through, and it's very clear that you feel very strongly about it. And ultimately, it's about human dignity and ability of humans to be what they are and live up to their maximum potential. We are big fans of your organization because I think you are truly one of those nonpartisan, equal opportunity, organizations out there that truly believe in their in the principles that guide their existence. How did this organization come to be? And by the way, it's such a cool name. I mean, FIRE. I mean, I don't know who worked on it, but that's incredible. But can you tell us a little bit about your organization and how many people work there? Where are you present? And if there are any opportunities for you to work with your counterparts in Europe and other places where they might think similarly?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess we did win the acronym lottery there. With the name
true.
FIRE. But we have been around for over 25 years now. We were founded by a University of Pennsylvania professor and a civil liberties lawyer. And so when we started, we were doing solely campus work. And that was actually most of our work for only 2 decades. We were solely focused on academic freedom and the First Amendment in higher education and ensuring we could protect those rights on our campuses. But a few years ago, we noticed that there were issues off campus too that we needed to address. And so we expanded about 3 years ago to be a national First Amendment group. So if you have a First Amendment case, give us a call. We'd like to hear about it. We may be able to litigate. But so we have been doing not just campus, but free speech across the U.S. And we take our nonpartisan creds very seriously. You can look through our social media mentions and see that we have a lot of different people mad at us, a lot of different days.
That's a good sign that you are truly nonpartisan when a lot of different people are mad at you. Yeah.
Exactly. But that's what comes with the job. And we're not here to serve any one point of view, party, anything like that. We just want to help Americans and people here in the U.S. speak freely. And that's the extent of it. We think it's really important for society, and we think it makes the world a better place. And so that's all we want to do. So if you need some help, call us. We'd like to hear about it. And when it comes to these issues in Europe and how they affect us, we've been noticing in recent years that, especially when it comes to internet speech, you can't just fight this battle in the US alone. There are a lot of things taking place that affect speech across borders. So we are always trying to be in touch with people around the world to try to advocate for better speech principles that actually end up helping Americans too. If social media companies, for example, change their policies so they can match one country's law, that actually might be a lot worse for Americans. So we want to help make sure that we have a freer world and a freer internet, because that's actually the only way we can have a free United States too.
Well, let me ask you this, and this is not to challenge, but rather to, I think, again, sort of frame the conversation, because I think in the context of Europe and other societies, we might have a pushback on this, but free speech. Awesome. But let's say you are a parent of color in Charlottesville back when the Proud Boys are walking down the street or other white nationalists are walking down the street, and you have to explain to your child who doesn't understand what's happening that this is a good thing, that they should be able to do it. Or if you are a parent of a Jewish student who, they're on campus and they're watching what's happening and they're really, really scared for their child, and somehow they need to be able to process this as a good thing. Or again, if you are a Muslim parent or just a Muslim in America and sitting members of Congress are literally posting tweets saying that you don't belong in the country, that you need to be deported, that you need to go back to your country, although you might have been born in the United States, and this is your only home. For them to process this, what do you tell them? And I know it's a very tough question and maybe not a fair question, but I do think it's an important question to ask as we're talking about freedom of speech.
Absolutely. So, number one, if someone's telling you that every free speech question is an easy one, and these are always easy conversations, they're not necessarily telling you the truth, because there are really difficult things. And here's the reason why. The reason why free speech is so important to defend is because it's powerful, because it can move us, because it can make us feel things, because it can make societies feel things. And sometimes it makes us feel deeply negative things, and it makes us feel unwelcome and unwanted. But the flip side of that is free speech also has incredible power to move societies in the right way. And I believe in the long run, that's what it does. But yeah, so we do have to answer the questions of what about the speech that hurts a lot of people and makes them feel unwanted and afraid? And Yeah, the reality is sometimes some speech does that, but there are greater risks in giving the government power to define what speech is too hurtful, too harmful, too offensive. And actually, what we've seen time and again is usually when governments get that power, it doesn't always work the way one might think it will. It's not always going to be defending people against, people perceived as minority communities against offense, but very often governments like to usurp that power just to target their own critics. And so that's the big risk of how we deal with free speech issues. We have to accept that, or we have to acknowledge that some people do have really negative responses and experiences with speech, and that does exist, but that there's an even greater risk in giving government power to weigh in there and start deciding who's allowed to speak based on what the government thinks is offensive.
That's, again, poet of free speech. I think that's your new title, and if you do use it, please credit me. But I think that's 100% correct. And I think the other thing is, I'd rather have a society where we can see these threats out in the open and people can express them, so we can understand and counter if need may be, and instead of this. I mean, the ills of society, they tend to show themselves in other ways as well, right? So I think I'd rather have them out in the open than, there might be some actual violent acts, which does not mean that, speech cannot lead to violence, but I think what you said is 100% spot on. I think it's a good segue into talking about, much of your work has looked at the difference between free expression, the idea of the conception of free expression in the United States and in Europe. And I think as of late, at least I think in the past year, this has truly become a major conversation point. We have people from, senior people from U.S. administration publicly talk about what they believe is a violation of free expression in Europe. So let me ask you this. How do you see that? Is that truly the case? And where have we, if that's the case, where have we diverged, United States and Europe?
Yeah, so there's a lot to unpack with that question. So first, what's been happening the past year has absolutely been, a major discussion across borders. And a lot of it goes back to a speech that J.D. Vance gave a little over a year ago at Munich, where he was picking apart, what's traditionally been seen as American allies for diverging from the U.S. on free speech issues. And a couple of points here. J.D. Vance is correct on that front. Many of our European allies have very different standards for free expression than we do in the United States, especially when it comes to hateful or offensive speech. And so we have definitely diverged with those countries when it comes to how we treat speech that's offensive and what we expect governments to do in response to that speech. But the second part of it is that J.D. Vance has not been a very good messenger for that issue. I can tell you at FIRE, we've been very busy over the past year dealing with illiberal threats and outright First Amendment violations from the administration that J.D. Vance is a part of. So a lot of people who are hearing his criticisms on the other side of the ocean are saying, why on earth should we listen to you? You're a censor as well. And so that's the difficult situation we're in right now. We're both acknowledging that J.D. Vance is correct on some of the criticisms he's making about our European allies and their speech policy. But it's starting to look like, the doctor needs to heal himself here, and that the U.S. needs to be looking within its own borders, too, because we have a lot of problems we need to deal with here. But going back to the question about, how we diverged and where those differences come from, a lot of it is in the past, recent decades over the 20th century, how we dealt with hateful expression and what kind of authority we give the government. So a really good example to look at is, obviously the World War II determined a lot of the political status of the world today, where borders are, how countries run. And a number of European countries, because of what they dealt with in World War II, have criminalized Holocaust denial. So they have criminalized expression that says the Holocaust didn't happen, or says there's, it's a conspiracy, or there's huge exaggeration about the number of deaths that happened. And so that's one example where we really diverge. In Europe and some of the countries, the idea is that this speech has been so damaging to society, and the history it represents is so dangerous that there's a role for government to act there. But here in the United States, that speech is protected by the First Amendment. It's going to be very unpopular. A lot of people are going to be angry about it. A lot of people will criticize it and say they didn't want to hear it and that it's unwelcome. But the government can't arrest you for it. You can't be fined for it. You can't be punished for it by the government. So that's where we really diverge on issues like that.
That's incredible. I mean, I think hate speech being free speech in the United States, I think, and in Europe, that is what you're saying. It's not necessarily the case. I think that's probably maybe sort of a basic foundation to it. But do you think, do you think just societally, if there's, Americans obviously are incredibly freedom-loving people. And I think that's something that, we will just societally we will not accept limits on our ability to do things. As you said, we believe that these are God-given rights and freedoms, and government is there just to, should not really interfere unless it absolutely has to. Do you think in Europe, societally, it's more acceptable? And do you think if they actually went to something like we have here, where, like you said, there are limits on free speech, but they're very limited and very well defined. Do you think that would be, how do you think, would it benefit them, or do you think it would hurt them? Why should they look to the United States for an example?
Well, I would love to return actually to the discussion I was just having about Holocaust denial and anti-Semitism. So there are much greater restrictions on that kind of expression in Europe. But if you look at the rates of anti-Semitism, they are higher in countries that restrict and ban that speech than the United States, for example, where that speech is protected. So a fundamental question here is not just, are these laws or restrictions or bans morally right? Are they legally right? But also the question is, do they work? And I actually don't think they do. I think that, for example, if you look at Germany right now, there's a lot of advancements from certain parties that are perhaps even their speech has been, the party members' speech has been censored. There's been a lot of efforts to, calls to ban the AfD. It doesn't actually work. And and so, we can, I have strong opinions about whether it's right or wrong to ban that speech. But just on a simple level, I don't think it actually solves the problem. And in some ways, actually makes it worse. If you have severe illness and you say, I'm just going to cover it up and go about my day, that doesn't mean it's actually going to make the problem go away, right? If you just pretend something isn't there, it doesn't go away. So in some ways, it's actually more dangerous if you censor the speech, if you force it underground, if you make it so that people are pushed into even more extreme places and communities to discuss these things. And that's what I think Europe is at risk of when they have these kinds of bans. You're not going to make the speech go away. You will never make those ideas disappear. That's not how ideas work, and that's not how human beings work. And you need to be able to debate them in the public square, even if a lot of people find it hurtful and offensive and dangerous. It may actually be better in the long run if you allow those debates to happen.
I think this may be the single best argument for free speech that I've heard, and I think that's, you put it much more eloquently, but I think this is what I was trying to, talk about, say, when we talked initially about the pain that potentially may come with free speech, but also that, I'd rather have it out in the open than manifest itself in ways that then hard to manage, or truly violent and truly hurtful and hurt people in ways that just, free speech potentially could not. That's fantastic. Let me ask you this. You said that, just kind of now looking back to home, you said that you've been busy, to put it politely. What are some of the things that you're looking at within the United States right now, or what are the trends that you're seeing that endanger or threaten free speech here?
Yeah, there's a lot. How much time do you have? So essentially what we're seeing right now is almost across civil society, we're seeing different threats to free expression and to free association and people's ability just to express themselves. So one example, what's been happening in higher education. There have been a lot of criticism, some of which coming from FIRE, about higher ed and the way it's conducted itself around free expression. But that does not mean that the President of the United States gets to suddenly start decreeing what happens in universities, including private universities, and start telling them how they have to operate. And in some cases, those rules have actually been related to political speech and the way that people talk about Israel. And that's been very troubling. More broadly, the issue of higher ed, we're looking at international students who are fearful that they're going to be deported because they say something the administration doesn't like, and they're not wrong to feel that way. FIRE actually launched a lawsuit last year over these viewpoint-based deportations of people who are here legally and who just say something the government doesn't like. And as I was saying earlier, the First Amendment isn't something the government gives to us. The First Amendment is a limit on government power. And so we can't just have the government deporting people because they don't like what that person says. And this is something that people should understand across party lines. I know some of the speech that's in question today is very upsetting and hurtful to some listeners. And they might say, good, I don't want those people here. But a president you might not like as much could enforce that power in the future, or an administration could enforce that power in the future. And that's the way we have to understand free speech. It's a tool that anyone can use. And when you allow them to censor like that, you're not just allowing your friends to censor. Your enemies might be able to use that power as well. So that's a lot of higher ed questions. Also, the attacks on law firms. That's a kind of a basic fundamental issue. Can people represent parties and ideas and cases that the government doesn't like? I think in a free society, that's a bit of a requirement. And, what's especially interesting is there has been a lot of reasonable criticism from the Trump administration when it comes to internet censorship overseas. There's a lot of issues taking place there, but we've actually been seeing that this administration has been using administrative subpoenas to try to find out the information of people who have anonymously criticized the government online here in the United States. And that's as Apple as American pie, right? Or as American as apple pie, the ability to criticize the government anonymously. That's going back to our founding is something that we believed was vital to this country, that you could say what you think about the government without having to attach your name to it. So that's just a few of the examples we're dealing with here, but it's really been across the board. This administration trying to use its authority to crack down on speech it doesn't like. And, just a few months ago, after Charlie Kirk's horrific shooting, we saw a lot of pressure from the administration on universities, other institutions, to fire people who had said things that the government doesn't like about Charlie Kirk. And we even had Attorney General Pam Bondi suggesting that it was hate speech, what people were saying about Charlie Kirk. And so we're getting to a really basic question here. Are we now going to start adopting European notions of hate speech for the Trump administration? So there's a lot that's been going on here, and a lot of it's troubling.
That's massively ironic, to say the least. Let me ask you about higher education. It seems like it's a very difficult business these days, running higher education, an institution of higher education, because on one hand, you've pointed out all the very obvious and things that we've seen, everyone has seen in the news. On the other hand, and you talk about it in your book about how China, for example, or other authoritarian regimes, because they spend so much money, or because they are such an important financial column for these institutions, that they also try to pressure them into modifying what they teach and how they teach and how they talk about certain things that these regimes might find something that doesn't fit their narratives. So, can you talk about that as well? So, what is happening there? And it seems like this is something that is less explored, that is less talked about, and seemingly as dangerous.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is, in some ways, it goes back to a very simple issue, money. People want to do what they can to retain access to funding sources. And so sometimes they will adjust their behavior, and in this case, censor speech, to retain access to that money. I don't think that's a particularly difficult concept or shocking to people. But what might be shocking to them is the way it's happening and conducting itself in higher education. So there we have universities that are perhaps willing to disinvite government critics of a foreign country just to retain funding. And so that's something that's been happening for a number of years here in the United States and actually around the world. So we've had, in some cases, direct orders from government officials for universities to disinvite Tibetan speakers, Taiwanese speakers, or just people who have criticized the Chinese government and the human rights violations that it has overseen against activists and minority communities within China. And that's been happening for decades now. Sometimes it's been as obvious as Chinese consulates ordering universities not to have a speaker. And I think that's really incredible here, that we have a foreign government dictating what can be said and taught at an American university. That to me is offensive, honestly, that's taking place. And so then we also have hundreds of thousands of international students, many who are coming from China, who come to the US and they find that the Chinese government has actually followed them here. And they're being threatened. They're being told that their families are going to go to prison if they don't shut up and if they don't do what the Chinese government tells them here. And that's really disturbing that this is taking place. Our universities are supposed to be, one of our crowning achievements for free expression here in the United States, right? Isn't that the dream that you can go to campus and speak your mind, and you can hold a protest in the quad, you can write a paper, you can say what you think. But then to have foreign governments trying to change that and dictate what can be said, and also using the fact that American universities are reliant on them for funding to manipulate them, it's really disturbing. And it doesn't get quite as much attention because, people might not notice if a Tibetan speaker is disinvited from campus, but that doesn't mean it's any less important. In some ways, it's more important that we act on this now if we haven't been realizing it's been taking place. There's a fascinating example I'd like to give from George Washington University a few years ago. So this is a campus at the heart of Washington, D.C., and some students there anonymously posted flyers that were showing artwork criticizing human rights violations in China and suggesting that they shouldn't be holding the Beijing Winter Olympics. And some student groups complained to George Washington's administration, and the university actually said they were going to censor them. But not only that, they were going to uncover the anonymous critics of the Chinese government who had posted these flyers. Exactly. And they actually initially directed their campus security to start reviewing footage to see who criticized the Chinese government on an American campus. It's incredible. So a lot of people, myself included, when we caught wind of that, said, what on earth is happening here? And so the university changed course, but those students, it turned out, were actually international students from China. And so to have an American university do that could have put them into real danger. If that was on their transcript when they returned home, that could be prison time. That could be severe repression, all because they put up a flyer and a university chose to punish it rather than stay true to its free speech promises. So things like that have been happening across campuses, and it's gone by quietly, but not for the people involved, some of whom it could potentially be life or death. So we really need to understand this is part of the broader free speech issue on campuses. Our universities are global, and so they're going to have global free speech challenges.
This is incredible. I had not heard about this, and it is disturbing to say the least that an established American university, something pride and joy of this area for sure, but also of the entire nation, that they would go to such lengths to do what? I mean, what happened there? It's an incredible story. So thank you for sharing. In your conversations, I'm sure you have a lot of conversations with people from all walks of life, Americans. When you talk to them, do you feel like there is this just broad support? I mean, there might be some, partisan disagreements on here and there, but Do you think there's just a general sort of, again, societal consensus that this is very important, that this is something that makes America unique, that's something that truly, if we lose, we might just lose that, what makes us so special? Is there that understanding, or do you think people are more bogged down in their sort of partisan ways and they want free speech for themselves, but they don't want free speech for their enemies, foes, people they disagree with?
I do think we unfortunately have a prevalent free speech ideology, but that's a global issue where people say, of course I support free speech.
Yeah.
But, and then there's a few examples of who doesn't deserve speech rights. But I do think that Americans understand and they care about these values and they take pride in the idea of this being a place where you can express yourself and there shouldn't be consequences from the government just because what you say isn't what your neighbor says or what your community believes. And so I do think people take pride in it, and we're always going to need to do a little bit more work to try to make sure people remember why they believe that and what it is they actually believe, because sometimes we forget, and we are in really partisan times, and feels like sometimes it can be harder to get people to see why those values matter. But I do believe, I'm an optimist, I believe that we're always going to be able to convince people to see the side of good and to support free expression. So it's a challenging time, but I think that we can get people soon to say just free speech and not free speech, but.
Yeah. Excellent. Let me ask you this, and this is probably a little bit uncomfortable, but free speech used to be seemingly a more of a conservative Republican talking point. Not necessarily Republican, but it's conservative. You don't have to subscribe to a political party necessarily, but it was one of those things that and I don't know about a lot about the origins of FIRE, but it does seem like the pressure came maybe from the left. And please correct me if I'm wrong. Do you think it's still the case? And this is not to stir the partisan pot at all, but I'm trying to understand the challenges in the United States and how your perception or being part of, this political group or that political thinking, if that may have an impact on that. How do you, has that evolved? Is that true? Or there's no truth to that? And everybody, like you said, as long as they can, partisans specifically, as long as they can express themselves freely, they just don't care about the issue necessarily.
Well, when it comes to higher education, I do think that more left-leaning political views are more represented in higher ed. So obviously that means that usually it's the minority viewpoint that faces free speech issues, no matter what institution or society you're talking about. So in higher ed, sometimes it did more often than not tend to be a case of conservative speech needing defense. That has not necessarily been the case in the past couple of years. It's certainly been across the board, especially when we look at speech about gender, speech about Israel and Palestine. It's a bipartisan issue, absolutely. And I think that, it's important to point out to people that some presidents, some administrations, some politicians, some are always going to be better about free speech. Some are always going to be worse. That's just a fact of life. But usually you can trust that free speech might matter more when you feel like your political party isn't in power. And so I think it's important to remind people that your party is eventually going to be out of power again, so you should probably make sure that they're not abusing that power when they are in authority, because maybe it can be your enemies that are using it next time too. So I think sometimes it is cast as a politicized issue, like, oh, that's a right-wing issue or that's a left-wing issue, but it's not that way. And it's unfortunate, I think, that that is the perception sometimes, but I think that's just a fact of life, that things are going to be politicized that way. And so it's our job as nonpartisan speech defenders to remind people that you really should want your enemies to be able to have the right to speak, because someday they might be in charge of determining your right to speak too.
Very much so, and hopefully also there's this broader consensus that we are ultimately, at the end of the day, regardless of what party we support or what ideas we support, that we are Americans, and that people who might be critical of you or your positions do it because they care about this country and they want to make sure that we move forward, that we are a better society. And this constant, I think this constant search for betterment is what Sorry, I'm sounding like, uber patriot here, but truly is what makes America, I think, unique and amazing. I do want to ask you one, maybe a couple of last questions. You said you were an optimist. What makes you worried the most right now, just in the United States and Europe, but also what gives you hope and makes you optimistic both in the United States and globally? Or maybe they converge, maybe they are the same thing.
Well, right now, what I'm worried about, well, a lot of things. But I am especially worried about the comfort that people are having at the moment with restrictions on internet speech. I'm very fearful, especially when it comes to how casually people might be embracing the idea of age verification, for example, across board on the internet. And, people have a good reason. We want to protect our kids. But it can be very often be the best of intentions that lead to the worst of outcomes.
Right.
So we need to understand that we can't look at these, emergencies or panics, and we can't allow them to take away our rights, because governments always have good reasons, right? And so right now, I think that reason is think of the children. But we can't allow concerns about protecting kids to ultimately actually end anonymity on the internet. I can't stress enough how important it is to be able to speak anonymously when you're talking about your government, when you're talking about your life. You can't be free if you can't speak anonymously, unfortunately. So that's something we really need to be careful. We always have a few of these examples. Think of the children. We have to protect national security. There's always going to be a good reason to censor speech and take away rights. Right. But it's never going to be a good enough reason that we follow through. So that's something that I'm worried about, because I think there could be really permanent, lasting consequences from this current craze, and that we may regret it someday. And what am I optimistic about? It's a little tough right now, I won't lie, but I think there are a lot of people around the world who are very courageous and have much more difficult battles than we're facing right now in the U.S. And they didn't lose hope. And so I think it's important that we show a little bit of humility and courage and understand that humanity has faced worse challenges before. We can overcome these again. And in my book, I spoke to a lot of students and a lot of people who were actually putting a lot of things at risk that most of us can't imagine. The idea of perhaps spending decades in prison just for speaking your mind. A lot of us can't imagine that, but there are people who do it every day. And so I think we can take a little fortitude from that and say, those people believe that what they're doing is worth it and that there's hope. So we should too.
I think that's a beautiful conclusion and sort of bit of a 360 to how we started this conversation about freedom of expression being about human dignity and human spirit. And I think you mentioning that people literally are dying for this or willing to go to prison for decades because they believe in these values, I think is a reminder that we should not take these things lightly, and we should defend them. It's important. It's worth. I mean, in some cases, worth dying for some folks. And what you're doing is incredible. If people want to connect with you, with your organization, or want to learn more about what you're doing, what are some of the best ways they can do it?
Absolutely. So our website, it's simple. It's fire.org. Just a few letters you got to type in. You can access our website, see all of our work. We're all over social media, X, Instagram, LinkedIn, wherever you want to look for us, we'll be there. And we'd love to have you check out, donate, see if you're interested in our work, and sign up for our newsletter and keep up with our work.
Sarah, thank you so much for joining again on this Friday afternoon. And this was an incredible conversation. I think there are a lot of valuable things that hopefully our people who are watching, our audience, will take away. And hopefully we're going to have this conversation again, maybe sometime soon. And maybe you're going to have more updates and more positive updates. Thank you once again, and for everything.
Thanks for having me.
Sure. Bye-bye.